All right, what's up? Welcome in, Wes Mitchell, Chris Clark, GC Live. Glad to be back with you. Chris, I think it's been a minute, man, since you and I have been on here. Apologies if you missed us. Hopefully you did a little bit, but figured it was time to hop on here. Maybe not the most ideal time if you're watching us live. Gamecock baseball currently on as well, but maybe you can do both. If not, hopefully you're listening to us or watching us later on, because we do archive every episode on all the podcast platforms and, of course, on YouTube. If you search for Gamecock Central on there. Of course, welcome in. And, of course, always presented by our friend Clint Hammond of Movement Mortgage, clint.hammond.com, 803-771-6933. And tell you what, that's actually the office number. Y'all give me 1 second. We're supposed to be using the new graphic. There it is. That's the cell number for Clint, 803-422-6797. Easiest way to get to Clint Hammond if you're thinking about buying a home in the Columbia area or really throughout South Carolina and even beyond that. Chris, spring is out of the way. The Welcome Home Tour is now out of the way. And believe it or not, the South Carolina football team will report to campus the beginning of next week while the rest of us are enjoying our Memorial Day. Those guys will be getting rolling. So before we know it, you and I will be hanging out at June camps. We'll be gathering information on recruiting official visits that have been wrapping up, and we'll be rolling through a very busy June.
Yeah, man, there's really no rest, really no off season. I mean, those things that you just mentioned have wrapped up. Of course, still got Gamecock baseball going on, but there's more football right around the corner here. Really, Wes, I would say not even June, right? May 31st is an important date. Number one, that is actually the very first installment of 2024 Shane Beamer football camps on May 31st. And then that happens to be a Friday. That is actually going to mark the first official visit weekend too. Going through, there's been some changes lately. There's been some revisions, some additions, some subtractions to the football official visitor list for this summer. Got 3 weekends that we're really going to be tracking. May 31st, June 7th, June 21st are going to be kind of those main weekends for official visits in the month of June. And there's going to be some talented prospects in that very first weekend right off the bat, in addition to the first of 10 summer camps. So should be a good bit of activity starting on that date for sure.
Yeah, no, that month has become so big. Matter of fact, Shane Beamer talked about that a little bit yesterday in Myrtle Beach, again, as he closed out the Welcome Home Tour. Talked about a number of different things, and there was surprisingly, Chris, still, as we would say, a little bit of meat on the bone in terms of stuff to talk about, even though Beamer has done, I think, 8 welcome home stops. And of course, he spoke after basically every Tuesday during spring practice. There were still a few things to talk about. Of course, among those would be potential changes coming to legislation in sort of the NIL world. And obviously, we've been tracking that for a while here closely locally, Chris, with the new South Carolina state law that's, hopefully going to be official. And then, of course, all the talk nationally in terms of legislation on potential revenue share and, possible back pay and all kinds of stuff there. Beamer, I think, and y'all can go back and watch the whole video if you want or listen to it. We got a transcript as well on GamecockCentral.com. But like most coaches, dude, I think you can only spend so much brain power or energy wondering or predicting or even thinking about what that might look like if you're a head football coach. Like, you have enough on your plate. It's almost like deal with it when it gets here, right?
Yeah, and Beamer's even in the past with certain things, mainly related to NIL questions, whether it's when the new state law was passed, when in 2021, right, when the state law was suspended, when the new state law has come about, and other NIL related things. He's very much taken that approach of NCAA rules, right? He's asked about those a lot, recruiting calendar things, etc. And I understand why he's asked those questions, because sometimes coaches do have good things to say, Beamer included, that are insightful. But a lot of times, man, he's just taking the approach of, look, we don't have a ton of say in those rules. They'll tell us what they are, and then we just kind of deal with them from there, right? And that is really a good approach. The biggest thing I think as a coach that you need to worry about, quote unquote, is to just be prepared for what can you do as a coach to prepare for any changes. And then if there's any lobbying you can do to your own administration of, hey, I really think we're going to need this particular resource, or I think we need to go in this direction, then those are things you can do, right? But a lot of it is just kind of sitting around watching. I mean, Shane Beamer, frankly, Wes, has very little to do with, what the settlement amounts are going to be from the House case and how they're going to be paid out and things like that. There are some things that certainly NIL related that he can have more control over, can worry about more. And actually the new state law in the state of South Carolina, once it's officially law, does make it more accepted and legal for coaches to be more involved in some of those processes. But when it comes to those big picture things like revenue sharing, conferences voting for a settlement or not, he's not as much in the picture of those type of things.
Yeah, and I think that's in some ways as it should be. And certain things, like you said, coaches, there may be certain just issues that maybe a coach feels strongly about. And maybe they want to get a little bit more involved when it comes to just something that particular coach maybe is close to their heart, or just that they have a strong opinion about. But as Beamer said yesterday, this thing changes every day, every month, every year. So you really can't even get locked into too much of a, well, hey, this is how things are now, because it can shift on you in a real hurry. But anyway, the team itself, I do think, as much flack as people give the NCAA, and a lot of it from time to time is warranted, one thing that almost all coaches I think seem to be in favor of has been this change the last, and it's not brand new, it's really the last few years, where they've been able to do a lot more with players in the summer. And in the past, it's really been locked down. You would have those player run practices where you could do certain things and you could just sort of turn the guys loose. But I always thought it was weird that you would have like a workout for the team, but only the strength staff was even able to watch it. And
no ball, I mean,
yeah, like, coaches are sitting there, oh, I'm hanging out in my office. My office happens to overlook the weight room. Let me take a look at the guys. How silly is that? They're in the same room, but they can't be there. So the NCAA has made some common sense changes that, I don't even know. I think it's been maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years now that this has been in place. But essentially, especially for these guys that are just arriving, you got the 2 transfer wide receivers that'll be coming in next week. You got Matt Fuller, Michael Smith, Jalewis Solomon coming in as high school guys who didn't go through spring. They'll be able to spend some extra time with the coaches. They can do certain things on the field in terms of almost like walkthroughs. It's not true spring practice or preseason practice. But point being, when these guys all report next week, they will have, of course, the workouts that you're going to have. I think it's 4 per week in terms of lifts and the traditional summer strength and conditioning, which is just, it's tough. Like, there's always that welcome to the SEC moment for guys, I think. But also, there will be some things the staff will be able to do to get these newer guys acclimated a little bit faster than it used to be.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly important when you look at, not to rule out anybody being able to make an impact, but the guy that it kind of seems like Shane Beamer has circled out of that group of the 3 freshmen, and then Jerome Simmons is a junior college guy, Wes, is going to be Solomon. We know that other corner spot opposite of O.D. Fortune is still kind of up for grabs. And there's some candidates there, and they're candidates to be, maybe a 3rd corner in certain situations. But, you've got Emory Floyd and Vakari Swain, and you've got Judge Collier. But Jalewis Solomon is someone who's expected to be at least in the conversation there. And when you look back, a couple freshmen in the 2022 class that Beamer references a lot, Nicky Minori, DQ Smith, they came in as true freshmen who were summer enrollees. I don't think anybody, even if you really like them as prospects, expected them to come in and start year one, even given South Carolina's situation in the secondary, even given their talent level, right? One reason being that they did enroll in the summer. But some of these rule, relaxations over the course of the last few years, I think that's helped. I mean, would you like a guy to enroll in January? Sure. Go through winter workouts, go through spring practice. And that's why more kids than not tend to do that. Again, there's a reason we're only talking about 3 guys out of the high school class that have not enrolled so far. But those guys, I think it gives them an opportunity to hit the ground running a little bit more than maybe several years ago when some of these rules were more buttoned up.
Yeah, and that's the highest percentage I think I've ever seen at South Carolina in terms of the high school class, almost all enrolling in spring. And I look at it on balance, man. It's huge for those guys. At the same time, it seems like if you can play, you can play. Like how many guys have come in and we just instantly hear this was the case with Nick when he got here. Like maybe not he's going to start, but we instantly heard in the summer, like this guy has been impressive. He's hit the ground running. And so I think, you look at Tree last year. Now, how valuable would it have been for Tree to be able to go through spring practice? I would argue extremely valuable. And so he comes in and then he's, starting by the Georgia game in Athens against number 1 team in the country. So it's valuable. And a guy that Beamer talked about yesterday, I actually talked about both those guys. Josiah Thompson was able to go through spring practice and was able to get that under his belt. I tend to think you look at some guys more than others and you say they need to have a great summer. I look at Josiah, and when I look at the position he's playing, when I look at just the incredible talent that this kid is, the ability to move, the ability to bend at his size, has the toughness factor as well, is willing to mix it up. He really checks all the boxes. You're just saying, how quickly can he come along in a SEC strength program, I think. So to me, I think that when you look at Josiah Thompson, you say, like, if I'm making a list of 5 guys that need to have a great summer, he's one of them. And that's not in any way a dig on him. That's more just because he could potentially be that good that fast. So I think for him, this is key for him to be able to stack on that 10, 15 pounds of muscle the next, I would say, 3 months.
Yeah. And I think there are multiple reasons why you need Thompson to have a big summer and a big preseason camp. One, Wes, is that quite frankly, left tackle is still just very up for grabs and it's still a question mark. Now, do you feel better in, May of 2024 than you did May of 2023? That's probably fair because last year you lost Jalen Nichols in the spring game. You remember, even all the way up until game 1, there was a big question of who's going to be your left tackle, who's going to be your right tackle. And then as we saw in that game, you lost Casey Henry early. You give up 9 sacks. It does not go well, right? And so those fears were very much put into action, and you saw what happened. This year, I think the sense is, on paper, this is all on paper, most of it, right, that you've got some more options because you've got a freshman in Thompson who is a freshman, but he's very promising. You got Ja'Kai Moore, who has, you gave it on the radio, what's he played, 30, 40 games during his career? Mm-hmm. He's started a bunch of games. He's played multiple positions, including left tackle, right? And then you've got Tree Babalade, another promising young player who now actually has some game experience to speak of. Does that mean left tackle is going to be just loaded and set this year? No, it does not. But do you have more options? Yeah, even if you're very down on the O-line as a whole, you could certainly say that. But I think you need the best guy to ultimately emerge. And, man, that could be Thompson. I think a lot of people in the program, from what we've heard, are looking around going, this guy can not only be the tackle of the future, he might even be the present. But in order to get there, certainly, like you said, adding some more weight, getting bigger, getting stronger, continuing to add practice reps and experience, that's going to be important for sure.
No doubt. By the way, appreciate everybody joining us here on the live show. Travis Ford says, listen to these two talk. Sounds like we are, in fact, loaded. Does every year. I mean, I want to find one instance of me and Chris saying this team is loaded. Travis also says, everything I read sounds like we are loaded for 2024. Matter of fact, I bet there's not a Gamecock website out there that has said the word South Carolina is loaded for 2024. Like not even just ours. Find me any instance of that and bring it to me. And I would love to see that because I know we have not said that. And we say this every offseason. If you listen to us, we're talking about position battles within South Carolina's football program. If we're talking about a standout at practice, we're talking about practice. That has nothing to do with what that guy may do matching up against Arkansas, matching up against Alabama, LSU, Georgia, whoever. We're talking about guys that are doing what is asked of them within the context of South Carolina's football program, within the context of the mythical depth chart that does exist, and who is potentially stepping up and being a starter or being a difference maker. But just because you're a difference maker doesn't mean you're going to be a 10-win football team, an undefeated football team. Debo Williams was not even a starter going into last year. Debo Williams stepped up last offseason, and he ends up being an all-SEC performer. So you can have good players, and you can have position battles within your team that you can talk about and you can discuss without that meaning you're a loaded team. Spencer Rattler got drafted this year. Xavier Legette got drafted this year. You can have good players, but that doesn't always, just because we're talking about good players doesn't mean anyone's saying South Carolina's winning 10 games or loaded or right. anything like that. So I think that's an important distinction to acknowledge. We're going to go in depth about the team. We're going to talk about every aspect of the team. Just because we're saying this guy has potential or this guy has a huge upside does not in any way mean we're saying South Carolina is loaded as they go up against probably one of the hardest schedules on paper in school history.
Yeah, and I think even saying things like South Carolina has depth at this particular spot. Look, you could think this team is going to win 0 games this year, right? Like to use an extreme example, or that they're going to win 3 or 4 games this year. If you don't think that they have more, depth at defensive tackle and linebacker than they had last year, then you're frankly just not paying attention, because they absolutely do. Now, and we're going to talk about those things because, as you said, Wes, it's our job. We're going to take very deep dives into the team. We kind of get into the weeds on a lot of those things. There are other spots where you got big question marks, and I think we're very frank about all those things. You still got question marks on the O-line. There's an element to prove it on the defense, right? Even though on paper you've added some pieces and you've returned some pieces. Can you go out and stop the run, right? Can you run the ball? Lenore Sellers is super talented, but he hasn't played a lot of college football at all, certainly not in a starting role this year. So there are plenty of questions. Some positions have more depth than last season. Some are more of a question mark. And as you said, we know that this schedule is absolutely loaded. So, yeah, great distinction when we're talking about guys. This guy's been doing really well in practice. That does not mean, if it's a receiver, that he's going to go catch 99 balls this year against this schedule, right? There are good players on this team, and there's more depth at certain spots, and there's questions at certain spots. And so we're just going to try to break that down about as well as we can.
By the way, if you are joining us live, if you don't have the baseball game on in the background, currently 1-1, top of the third, South Carolina with a runner on first and nobody out. So South Carolina scored first, Arkansas answered, and we'll certainly see how this one goes and keep you all updated as we go along. Chris, let's see, where do we want to take it right now? I did think for the most part, you do get a little bit of, I would say, repeat questions or just repeat answers on these things just naturally, because a lot of times at these welcome home tours, You have sort of local media guys that maybe are getting their first opportunity to interview Shane Beamer in a while. So they'll ask local questions. Of course, they ask the quarterback question. Sellers has kind of been the same answer for the most part, or a different version of the same answer. Every single one. There were a couple of new little updates. One being on injuries from Beamer. I thought it was not an incredibly detailed answer, but I think him saying that Rocket Sanders, quote, should be full speed ahead and ready to roll when we crank up next week. That's obviously a positive. And nothing real specific on Mo Kaba, but I think it was at least noteworthy that he said that Mo in the weight room. He was there earlier this week. He's in great spirits. He looks good. We'll certainly see what that looks like for Mo. Like we know how coaches talk about injuries. Like is Mo full go in the weight room right now, or to what extent? But I do think there were some positives there, particularly going back to what I said, Rocket sort of being full go, full speed ahead as they get into the strength and conditioning program here in the summer. That's something we talked about months ago. When you kick this thing off, are we talking about 90% Rocket? Or are we talking about 75% Rocket? And at running back, that's one of those spots, man. I feel like you can play running back early. Like, even if you're a freshman, you can play that spot early. But also, there's a certain level of conditioning when you hear people talk about, like, being in football shape. I think running back is one of those spots that it does take a little bit longer than maybe other positions. So that may still be in question, but it is at least that's a positive update from Beamer, in my opinion.
It is. And, man, that's one of the things that I think Gamecock fans, you knew pretty early that you weren't going to see Rocket Sanders in the spring, but that was something that I know Gamecock fans miss, not being able to see, Rocket Sanders in the backfield, not being able to see him and Lenora Sellers in the same backfield, get that opportunity this season. But it was always, you knew that he was projected to be good by the start of the season. And those questions will remain of is he 100% in game shape by then? I think this type of update that he's apparently going to be full go, will help him to get there, right? And this is a guy, man, that, like, fans were excited about Rocket Sanders, right? But has it almost gotten a little bit quiet on that front to where, not that people forgotten Rocket Sanders is on the roster, but, like, you start thinking about it going into the season. This is a guy that rushed for 1,400 yards in 2022. This is a really, really good, proven SEC running back. And to have a proven SEC running back who's healthy, his caliber, when that's been, frankly, a missing component, Wes, a lot of times in this offense, not just last season, but just really in the past, at times in the Shane Beamer era, that's definitely something you want to see. And it brings a big picture point, I think, to the surface too. And that if you're going to get through this schedule, and you can come up with whatever definition you want of get through, find some success against this schedule. Nobody's sitting here going, they should probably be 12-0, 11-1. No, I don't think a soul is saying that. But if you can find some success against this schedule, you're going to need to be a healthier football team than you were last year, especially at some certain spots. You're going to need to be healthy at quarterback. You're going to need to have your bell cow guys like a Rocket Sanders healthy. In the trenches, you got to be healthier, right? And so to get out of spring without any major injuries from any starters, depth guys, was a positive, and you got to continue that leading up to the season as well.
Yeah, and Chris, I think in some ways, the running back or the running game in general, obviously Rocket is included in this, but I look at the big picture of the running game, and it reminds me a little bit of last year. There were certain things that Beamer just seemed fixated on. And, how many times did he talk about trying to limit the amount of giveaways, like the amount of turnovers on offense last year? Like, he talked about it. Multiple press conferences, when he was asked, what's your one focus this offseason? Inevitably, that was one of the two or three things that always came up. I feel like he has been hell-bent basically to fix the running game. And that's why you see, I think, a change at running backs coach. You see a new running game coordinator. You see multiple transfers come in at that position. You see, and this part was somewhat just how it played out, but you also see a quarterback that can run as well that we know is going to take a little bit of pressure off the rest of the rushing attack. But I look at that. I think that and the O-line depth issues are just two things that were circled in permanent marker this offseason in terms of if this thing's ever going to get fixed, these two things have to take a step forward, have to be better. I think they actually, Chris, quietly were much better against the run defensively last year by the end than maybe people even think looking back on the season, at least compared to before. And, I know they'll want to continue to get better up front against the run defensively, but they definitely seem to be focused on the old adage of basically stop the run, run the football. Those have been the basics of football really since the game was invented.
They have been. And Wes, honestly, when they have not been able to accomplish those things, they have lost, right? When they have, they've been able to win. And for Carolina this year, to zoom out, we're getting ahead of ourselves and going big picture here, I think. But if you are thinking about those goals, they've got to be able to be more consistent, I think, in all three phases of the game. And like you look at last year, October, they were able to score some points, but they couldn't get stops defensively. They couldn't force a turnover. You flip to November, they played defense much, much better in November, but they weren't able to score enough points, right? By that point, the injuries had really piled up on the O-line. Xavier Legette was your best, your only option, consistent option at receiver. You couldn't run the football very well. Things looked stagnant offensively. You think about the Clemson game. You give up no offensive touchdowns at home, but can't win the game, So they've got to be able to marry those things where, you remember we sat down in Beamer's office in February and he said, look, we were not good enough on offense, defense, or special teams. And every coach takes a deep dive in the offseason as to what they need to change and what they need to fix. Beamer, I think, took that even a little bit further than usual. And I think, frankly, how the season went, how it ended, was the impetus for that. And that's why we saw more changes, than he's ever made here this offseason.
Yeah, no doubt, man. My webcam is struggling today. Holy cow. Anyway, y'all bear with me if you're on the video version. By the way, bases loaded right now for South Carolina. Gamecocks up 2-1. Y'all may be ahead of me. I don't know. I'm streaming it here as we go. Bases loaded, 1 out, 2-1, and Kennedy Jones at the plate. Chris, let's see. I think there was one more topic I wanted to hit. Maybe not. Let's push it forward to recruiting a little bit, because Beamer did talk about that yesterday as well, and just talked about this trend of guys taking their official visits in June and then deciding before their senior years start. And, he basically said pretty much every single one of their guys that they're recruiting coming up next month have that as a plan. He said, look, I would probably want guys to wait, maybe take their visit a little bit later. But if they're going to go ahead and decide, you have to go ahead and bring them in June. That'll be the case. And right off the bat, I'm sure we'll dive into this thing as it gets a little bit closer. Like you said, we'll have a final answer. We'll have kind of a final list. There have been some guys taken off. There's been some guys added. It's fairly close to accurate, I think, as far as who's coming in right now. But right off the bat, like you said, May 31st, that first weekend, South Carolina with some top targets in, some important targets in. Dude, you could circle several of these guys and say they're the most important. But, you look, Malik Clark coming in, big-time wide receiver. Jalen Gilchrist, a major O-line target for them. Jared Smith, a elite edge guy. Shoot, Isaac Souls Jr., who is a 3-star offensive lineman. It seems like every other weekend I'm on Twitter and he has won some O-line MVP award at a camp. So that's a guy who I got to think is going to move up in the rankings. And that's only a handful. Again, there you can go look at the full list on GamecockCentral.com. You can hit visits. But that's right off the bat a big weekend for Carolina.
It is, man. Malik Clark. Whew, that one, that one is spicy because here's a rock kill guy. It's typically been a location that's pretty good to South Carolina, with some of their best players in school history coming from that region. But you are in a legitimate battle of the Carolinas with the North Carolina Tar Heels. And there's always, it seems like there's always a little extra in those recruiting battles, Wes. He plays, a premium position and just has size and speed and really all the markers of a guy that, man, you really don't want to let get away. So that's going to be a big one. Spike Sowles, Wes, Isaac Sowles Jr., NFL bloodlines with his dad playing in the league. Just a really technically sound guy. I think I first saw him maybe 2, maybe even 3 summers ago, probably 2 summers ago as a younger offensive lineman. And you can tell he was someone that really had the staff's eye. And it seems like they've been recruiting him, forever. Jared Smith is a edge target. I mean, there are a lot of big timers, like you said, right off the bat. Really, you look at all the big weekends that they're going to be hosting official visitors. You can go up and down the list and say, this guy seems important. This guy seems important. And I think the chances, vary depending on the guy. There's some guys that'll take officials this summer where you go, that one might be a little bit of a longer shot. There's some where you go, they're in a decent spot. And if they could get this guy, it would be a really impactful get. So after hearing Beamer say that last night, I knew that the summer would be important, but it kind of hit home for me that, hey, all but 1, 2 of our guys that we're recruiting are going to decide this summer. That makes it even more important, to really make some noise this summer on the recruiting trail.
Yeah, and that's to your point, man. It's always fascinating. There will be a couple of guys, and I'm not talking about specifics. I'm just talking about this is how it always ends up. There's going to be a couple of guys on this list that Gamecock fans feel pretty good about, that we feel pretty good about, that everybody's reporting on Carolina being in good shape. Maybe they visit 3 other places, and they end up elsewhere. And there will be a couple of guys on this list because it just always happens. There'll be a couple of guys that maybe we're not really talking about Carolina as much. Maybe they're 3rd or 4th. They come in, they love the OV, and they commit. There will be some jockeying for position as far as who's out front with these guys. And but once again, and this has been the case the last few summers, you can sit there and say, man, you could build a heck of a probably top 10 class if you could land even just most of these guys that you're going to have on campus. You start to look at the tail end of this thing. I mean, Zayden Walker coming in that last weekend. Think about the hype that there's going to be for that guy to be in. Even Shed Surratt, he has started to shoot up the rankings and pick up some big time offers. So he's gone from maybe more of a little known in-state guy to being a big time recruit. Like you talked about Malik. I mean, he's a big time recruit. The state of South Carolina, I feel like, Chris, the spring has been very kind to Malik Clark and Jordan Gidron, who's from 2026, right down the road at Ridgeview. It seems like those guys have put together the measurables this spring that the recruiting guys love going into. For Malik, his senior year, going to be a key June for him, man. And then, of course, Jordan with 2 seasons left at the high school level.
Well, and you look at that 2026 class in state, West, I think it's shaping up potentially better for South Carolina than 2025, right? So 2025 was a class, let's kind of reverse engineer it. There were some struggles at the beginning when Shane Beamer got to South Carolina with in-state recruiting because, quite frankly, they were just behind. You're coming in during COVID. You've got a new staff. You don't have as many of the relationships. And so Clemson and some others were able to do better. They're able to turn that around Coach Beamer was and do a lot better in state over the past cycle or two. Now you've got, Mari Adams. Carolina led for him for quite a while. Clemson was able to get him committed. There's some other guys in the top 5, top 10 of the state that could very well end up going out of state, right? But you want to get as many of those priority guys as possible that you want committed. You look forward to 2026, and it's kind of shaping up better. I'm on the On3's industry ranking top football recruits in the state of South Carolina, and the On3 RPM, which is just one look at it, favors South Carolina for every single one of the top 6 guys in the state right now. Now, does it actually stand there with all of them? Maybe not. But Jordan Gidron, doing extremely well in track, extremely well in football. Columbia guy from Ridgeview. They've got a great shot there. And another 4-star in the Midlands at receiver too, Wes, Donovan Murph from Irmo, another guy that's really kind of blown up from the end of last season, then in this spring to the summer as well. So really good in-state prospects too coming up in the next class, and South Carolina is involved with several of those.
I'm excited for that class, man. Not just from a Gamecock perspective, but just it feels like maybe one of the better classes the state has had in a long time, especially if those guys keep progressing the way you think they might. Don't you feel like this is a state where sometimes the guys start to pop up a little bit later than maybe other states? But if we already know this many names, what happens when the 1 or 2 guys that inevitably will pop up then do pop up? And, I think you look at that could be a banner year for the Palmetto State if that group keeps progressing. Sometimes you see guys that are on the radar early and they almost kind of tap out their potential. But a lot of these kids, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think there's still some upside to go. Particularly you look at Gidron, that's someone, look at the track times. I may try to go. His spring game is Thursday night. I actually really want to see him in person. I'd love to compare him and Malik Clark actually as prospects at this point, again, because I think they've got a lot of momentum. But fun to see the state of South Carolina have some guys again. There's always some guys, but it just seems like there's more depth in terms of the top guys for that class. And as always, it's about evaluating in this state, man. I mean, you got to be smart about who you offer and just find the right guys in our state, because it can always seems like every year there's a couple of guys that fall through the cracks, and you read about them down the line being great players, somewhere else. So we'll certainly see what that looks like for South Carolina. By the way, Chris, let's go ahead before we go any further, and then we're going to probably get out of here a little bit early. Let's tell everybody about our friend Andy Luedecke, who, as you know, is a big sponsor, not just of our show, but also of several shows on the On3 network. And you've heard us talk about Andy quite a few times. And see if I can get this banner off here. Call Andy today, 404-973-9901, or shoot him an email, andy@myperfectfranchise.net. You may be saying, what is My Perfect Franchise? What does Andy do? Well, Andy is a franchise consultant, which means he will help people find franchises that fit their skill set, financial requirements, time to commit, and more. Now, the great thing about potentially using Andy's services is that those franchises, they are looking for people with certain skill sets as well. So that means for you, his services are 100% free. He is here to help if you have any questions about business ownership. So if you're ready to start something new, if you want to build wealth, if you want to leave a legacy, maybe it's more like starting a side hustle on top of your current job. Again, Andy is going to help you get matched up with a franchise that fits whatever your skills and your time to commit are in terms of helping you do so. So again, 404-973-9901, or shoot him an email, andy@myperfectfranchise.net. Chris, I thought it was interesting reading this, the ESPN SP Plus that comes out every year that sort of attempts to give you a way to compare teams and kind of gives you a sense of what your team would do against an average team on a neutral site. And interestingly enough, you look at this South Carolina schedule, and the SP Plus this year essentially says South Carolina should be favored in 4 of these games, and not just barely favored, like they should win. And then in 8 of these games, again, this is on paper, it says South Carolina should not be favored, and not just they shouldn't be favored, like they should not win, basically. And so, you see sometimes these metrics will have like 10 games that are supposed to be close. And you're like, well, what happens in all these games that are supposed to be close? This is not that. This is essentially saying that it would take a major upset for South Carolina to lose to any of these 4 teams they're favored over. But it would also take major upsets for South Carolina to win in any of these other 8 games that they are not going to be favored in. I do think if there's a saving grace for you as a Gamecock, there could be some built-in lack of Lenora Sellers factor in that to the metrics. I imagine Sellers is random quarterback A. He wasn't incredibly highly recruited if these metrics include that into their formula or algorithm or whatever it is. Yet internally, the hype is as high as I've ever maybe seen for a guy who hasn't started a game yet. So there's a path where these metrics are dead wrong based on what goes into them. But it does give you a little bit of a reality check on what the outside expectation could be for South Carolina this year. Again, just based on this formula.
Yeah, the other thing I wonder, Wes, and this isn't just exclusive to the S&P, it's really anything that you're trying to plug into a computer in the year 2024 to predict sports outcomes. Is the transfer portal going to make those more difficult? And look, so South Carolina's team is decently transfer heavy. They've got some impactful transfers coming in, 3 running backs, for instance, right? And then, you've got some newness in a brand new quarterback. You might have newness at left tackle, right? You've got some guys who are transfers who are going to be starters. You've got some who are maybe had been starters at other places, but now they're more depth pieces. They're a depth piece, they're a backup, they're a special teams guy. And I think that's kind of hard to account for because you can plug in a guy and say, well, this guy was this productive at this particular school, and you're having to make an apples to apples comparison. And as we know, you can't always do that. Now, you and I could probably go through the schedule right now and say, gun to head, is South Carolina favored in this game or not? And we may come up with that exact same number, quite frankly. And then week to week, we're going to pick the games. And I don't know. I couldn't sit here and people might say predict the season. I have no idea. It's May 22nd,
Yeah.
Week to week, I think that's going to change. But the point is, I think those things might be a little bit tougher to predict now, mainly because of the transfer portal and how you can construct a roster and kind of turn it around, not only as a team, but just, at certain positions too.
Yeah. And frankly, I don't know enough about does that thing plug in? Like if a guy has this much production at another place, does that get plugged in at this school? I think that's probably the most accurate way to do it. If you have a certain, a way you value a certain player and they do that at one place, can you transfer it over into the formula for their new school? I don't know. I think the person who best can quantify how a team has used the transfer portal probably will have the best formula in terms of accuracy for predicting those things. So I don't know. We'll see. I thought it was interesting. SP Plus always a at least solid barometer, I think, of where things are. But as with anything, you go into a season, man, and it quickly adjusts based on you quickly finding out, hey, this team is way better than we thought, or this team is way worse than we thought, which always happens. Travis says, come on, we have seen Sellers throw like 4 passes versus Furman scrubs. Travis, the thing about that, and Travis Ford I'm talking about, not Travis Edwards. The thing about that is just because you've seen him for 4 passes, what does that mean about his ability as a player?
Well,
like just because you've only seen him a little bit does not mean he couldn't be a great player. Like we're not just judging what we're saying about Sellers based on limited reps against Furman.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I literally said earlier in the show, there are plenty of questions about Sellers because he has not played. He doesn't have a lot of college experience. He doesn't have I'm the guy starting experience at the quarterback position. So I literally said that earlier in the show.
Well, he's responding to me saying that the Sellers factor could be big enough, like that he could be good enough to skew those numbers because he is not factored in. Like, yes, I am being incredibly positive about Sellers when I say that, but I think you look at this kid and we're teetering on the point of basically over, like, we don't want to teeter to the point of making the expectations too high for Sellers as a true freshman, but you have to acknowledge all the positive things you've heard about this guy, in that the potential is there for him to be the rare guy who just steps in and makes that immediate impact, because he does on top of the physical ability, he does everything right off the field as well. And that includes not getting too high on yourself, I think. And so when we know what a guy's physical ability is, which is through the roof with Sellers, then you hear the coach say things like how steady they are, how they don't get too high, don't get too low, how their leadership is coming along. To me, that is like a lot of times with superstars in the college game, there's always a point where nobody knows that guy's a superstar yet. Like before Deebo Samuel exploded, all there was buzz about Deebo in practice. But before, even Luedecke last year, we were all going, well, there's a lot of practice buzz, but we've heard a little bit of that before.
Yep.
And next thing you know, he's a first-round pick. So I think sometimes, yes, everybody gets ahead of themselves in proclaiming a guy's going to be a superstar. But sometimes when you're hearing all this buzz about a guy, it ends up being 100% correct. And it takes 2 games for that guy to be, oh, this is an SEC name everybody knows now.
Yeah. Well, and we've gone into other seasons for South Carolina where they've got a projected new starter at quarterback, and we're not sitting here saying, man, if that guy hits his potential, this is a potential multi-game swing X factor. Like, we really haven't had that. This is a different deal. Go talk to anybody who's watched Sellers play from high school onward. They're all going to tell you about all the different boxes he checks. I'm not talking about making one throw against Furman or one run against Vandy. We're going way beyond that and talking about the potential of, he's got to hit his potential. He's going to need help around him. Again, there are a lot of questions, but if your quarterback, which is the most important position on the field, we're not talking about who's going to play safety, right? If we're talking about the most important position on the field, and if that guy, A, has the ability to be a difference maker, that's almost undisputed. B, the part you can't argue, will he be a difference maker this year? But if he hits that, that changes the equation for you, if you're South Carolina. So, yeah, we're not just basing it off of something he's done when we watch practice for 5 minutes, or like, we're taking like a holistic approach and looking at how, like, if you talk to people that have been in college football a while, they will talk about Sellers' physical ability and what he has upstairs and his potential in pretty lofty terms. Pretty lofty terms, I'll say that. And so you do have to back up and recognize all the challenges and that he is a first-year starter, but the potential is there. And I'm 100% with you. If he can reach that or part of it this year, that can change the game for South Carolina.
Chris, there is one comparison to Sellers that I have heard from guys who have been at his scrimmages that I think I'm just going to hold on to until we get a little bit further down the road. But because I don't even want to say the sentence because it does sound a little bit out there. But I've heard it enough that I think it's valuable. I think it's potentially valid that I think I want to bust out later on down the road, preseason, once we get closer to the regular season. But, some of the names that are thrown out to compare his skill set are certainly lofty. And, we acknowledge that as well. But I think he has earned it, at least in practice. And we're going to all find out if he can earn that in games as well. But I'll tell you one thing. I'm not betting against this kid. Like, I'm really not. Like, I'm not betting against Lenora Sellers. And a lot of people who know him and have been around him much more than I have would tell you the same. So, anyway, all right, y'all. I think we're out of time. Chris, you got anything to add, man, before we get out of here?
No, I'm good, man.
All right, Chris is out. Chris is at Still Hands. He probably going to go get him an afternoon Still Hands beverage maybe. And I'm going to go watch the rest of this baseball game. And then we'll see y'all later on. All right, for Chris, I'm Wes. Appreciate our sponsors, as always, Andy Luedecke and Clint Hammond. Head on over to clint.hammond.com. We've enjoyed it. Y'all have a good one.